All right, what's going on, everyone? This is Decred in Depth. I'm your host, Angelo. And on today's show, we have our Africa lead and governance specialist, Mr. Akin Sawyerr. Akin, how you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing great. So let's get into your background and your genesis into the CC space.
Cool. So a background, I studied economics in college, and I spent my first couple of years out of undergrad working for the International Monetary Fund in Washington, D.C. It was an interesting experience. I thought I wanted to leverage my degree in some environment where I thought there could be some value in just learning more about how the world functioned from a markets and economics perspective. And so I spent 2 years at the IMF, and then, decided to go to business school to get my MBA. And when I got out of business school, I got into management consulting in DC, working primarily on federal government clients, right? So I did a lot of work with reg agencies like the SEC, Treasury, IRS. Spent a little bit of time in Homeland Security post 9/11, working on building the entry and exit system for foreign nationals. So after 9/11, there was a whole revamp of the system for foreign nationals to enter the United States through land and seaports. And so I worked on that more on a strategic standpoint, working on the design from a business process point of view, and worked quite closely with the technical teams that ended up building and deploying the system. So I did that for quite a while. And then, about 10 years ago, I had the opportunity to get involved with a mobile payments company in Sierra Leone called Splash Mobile Money. At the time, mobile payments were beginning to take off in Kenya with M-Pesa. Mobile penetration across Africa was accelerating. And so, I thought it was an interesting opportunity to get involved, early in an industry that I thought would be the future of financial services. I just had this theory that the future of financial services is going to, leverage mobile devices as a much more efficient way to transact. And so I got involved with Splash from a board level, and just helped in strategic and governance aspects related to growing a startup. Along the way, we got some inquiries and interest from remittance companies that were looking to leverage the Splash agent network. So it was an agent-based telco mobile payments network. And what that basically meant was, in Sierra Leone, when we launched, the vast majority of adults were still illiterate, and mobile penetration was about, I say, 35-40%. So you didn't have ubiquitous mobile access. And with the literacy issues, we just felt we had to have some sort of an agent-based system to be successful, at least in Sierra Leone. And as we started building that out and, showing some of the value, we got inquiries from remittance companies that basically wanted to plug into our system and leverage it as distribution for, global remittances coming into the country. And so, that got me beginning to just research more and understand the global remittance space. I just came to this, and I realized relatively quickly that, it was, basically had a handful of gatekeepers that really managed the flow of funds into and out of Africa. The banks and, a couple of large remittance companies, and they were quite inefficient. And because of that, the costs of moving money, particularly for the unbanked, was extremely high. Because, your money typically would have to hop through multiple middlemen. And by the time you got your cash, you'd have had to pay off, 4 to 6 different intermediaries along the way. So that got me curious about the space and just trying to understand and think about a better way. And that's how I got into the blockchain space. So I'd say about 2015, I got into Bitcoin, really initially as just sort of like this interesting thing. I used to be very, since I was in college, I was very interested in markets and stock markets. I invested in equities. I got into options trading a little bit. And so Bitcoin just seemed like this really interesting hybrid of, some kind of asset you could trade, that had some value. And I honestly didn't really know too much about it at the time. And then when I started understanding, blockchain on a protocol layer or level, I thought it could be a really interesting solution to the remittance problem. This global peer-to-peer network where people could exchange value, in minutes. And so that was my initial foray into kind of like Bitcoin, blockchain, and that's where I started.
And throughout all this, how is it that you came across Decred?
Yeah, so I started out really thinking about building a remittance company on blockchain, on a blockchain protocol, and but I just kept remaining curious about better understanding what Bitcoin was, understanding what this cryptocurrency. 2017, the rise of alts, and so I was really curious as to this just new market form, and I was trying to really understand what the implications of this basically new asset class or this new technology meant. And along the way, I think in early 2018, actually prior to that, I've been following Chris Berniski on Twitter for quite a while. At the time was one of the few pure investors I knew in the space, and he'd been putting out quite a lot of just good content. And at the time, and still, he'd been talking a lot about governance and why governance was going to be a big differentiator and driver of long-term success in the crypto space. And it made a lot of sense to me, just from a standpoint of, as long as human beings are involved in any processes, there has to be some sort of way it's governed, right? There have to be rules. There has to be a structure in place that, for decision making. And so I started really buying into this idea of governance as a really big, important piece and differentiator. And I discovered Decred when Placeholder published their investment thesis on Decred. And that was early 2018. And so I got really, really intrigued with this idea of a cryptocurrency similar to Bitcoin, but that came with a very unique governance structure and really led with this idea of a much more egalitarian system where every stakeholder in the network has some way to participate, some way to contribute, and had a voice. And I thought that was really interesting and unique about Decred.
How would you define governance?
I think simply governance is a system through which decisions are made, right? I think loosely. So and in many ways, I think about that. I feel like it has to be explicit. And so what I mean by that is a governance system that's opaque isn't really worth much to participants if you really don't understand what the rules of the game are and how and where you fit in the structure, right? So, a good example, the United States has a constitution, it has a set of laws, it has all sorts of rules that have been developed for, over the existence of the country for over a couple hundred years. And as a citizen, right, as a participant within the system, you sort of know where you fit, right? You need to pay your taxes. You know that you have the ability to vote. Like there's certain rights that come with that, and they tend to be pretty clear to everyone. And they don't change, every day, right? There's they change over time, but there's a clear way in which you can engage and participate and have a voice in how the system works, however imperfect it is. And I think that any institution that includes, people, there has to be some explicit understanding of how that system works, what the rules of the game are, and what people are buying into if they choose to participate in some way or another. And so for me, that's kind of how I think about governance loosely.
What are your thoughts on governance playing a role and its importance within crypto assets? I'll say its importance.
I think it's fundamental, and And I think it's really, and I've actually gotten to the point where I think it's fundamental at the onset. So crypto networks really need to think about governance and what structure they want to adopt up front or as early as possible. And the reason for that is, I think, first of all, when you think about these networks and how crypto networks grow, there's just certain things I think most people generally buy into. This idea of censorship resistance, idea that anyone, as much as possible, can access these networks and participate and add value and contribute. And because, in my view, because it's relatively easy globally for people to join and participate in these networks, it's really important for the rules of the game to be pretty clear, such that people know going into it what they're buying into. And I think it's important because wherever there's confusion in terms of, well, I thought it was going to be this, but it turned out to be that, then it sows, in my view, it sows seeds of either mistrust or seeds of confusion, or, people end up getting somewhere down the line and thinking, well, this is not what I bought into, and this is not what I thought it was going to be. And where the governance systems aren't clear, and it's not clear where power resides, who holds power, who has a voice, how is that voice wielded, it just creates a lot of opaqueness in systems that I think over time, as more and more value accrues to a network and there's more economic value at risk, it could create a lot of perverse incentives, right? It could, when people start making money or value starts accruing or wealth is being built, then where you don't have clear governance systems, then, those systems are prone to capture, right, by individuals who either want to capture most of the value, like it kind of bleeds into plutocracy where, a small group of people end up wielding an undue amount of power in a network. And that to me eventually creates problems that could either, impede the ability of the network to continue growing. And in some cases, it could be, the beginning of a downfall of a network. If, a lot of the, social trust or for whatever reasons, whatever people thought they were buying into, if it turns out that that's not how it's panning out, then, problems arise.
Akin, what are some of the strengths and weaknesses you see within DCR's governance infrastructure?
So I think from a strength standpoint, it's fairly clear. I think if you put enough time and effort into understanding it, it becomes very apparent what the governance system is and how you can participate and the various ways you can contribute, add value, and get a return for your effort. And I think, that's helpful to know that not only are the rules of the game fairly clear, I think a secondary strength is stakeholders have a say on how those rules evolve, right? And how the network evolves. So you have agency, right? You have a voice, you have a role to play, and you can exercise that role, right? And you can leverage it. And you can find other people within the network that share your views. And, you can build coalitions around your ideas. And there's a forum for those ideas to be shared, proliferated, debated, and ultimately for decisions to be made. And I think that's a really big strength. I think it's also a strength from the standpoint of, I have this idea of, culture being very important. So, government institutions end up building some sort of a culture. And oftentimes the culture of those institutions is defined by the rules, right? By the governance system. Because the rules in the governance system create certain incentives and essentially put, in my view, a network onto a certain path, right? And I think that a strength of Decred, because the governance is pretty clear, straightforward, and, was pretty much thought through up front, that's leading down a certain path in terms of the culture that's being built, right? And I think, some of those positive aspects are the fact that people have a voice, people that can express that voice, people have a vote, people can exercise that vote, right? So there is a clear social contract, and in many ways, I think it's also, I think a strength of the Decred governance system is the fact that it's what I call like self-selecting, right? I think that certain people that wouldn't like it and would never want to participate in that kind of a system, and that's fine. I don't necessarily think it's for everyone, but I think it attracts a certain kind of person who's looking for that idea of having some level of self-sovereignty, having a voice, being part of a network that has certain values that align with what you're trying to accomplish, right? So I think it has this nature of self-selecting certain kinds of people who are there for the long term, who see value in being able to contribute, and get something in return. And, so it creates a certain level of stickiness, right? I think people come and go, certain people stay, right? And I think the nature of the governance process and the culture that's being built as a result of that attracts a certain kind of person. And I think that's important. I think it's important because, in the nascent stages of a network, there's value in having some structure that builds cohesiveness. Because it's important, I think, this idea of consensus or the majority sort of generally agreeing on a path is really key because it builds a level of unity and strength that I think is really important in the crypto space. And I think that's something that Decred, that makes Decred stand out quite a bit. From a weakness standpoint, I guess the things I would say is there's some challenges or some barriers to participating. And what I mean by that is, Decred isn't something that you can really fully understand unless you put in some level of time and effort into it. And I think in some ways, people might misunderstand things because they don't have enough information, they haven't done the research. So there could be instances where folks who might be great or good people that you would want as part of the network, it might take them a long time to figure out that, okay, this is the sum of what Decred is, and now I understand it. So there's a process of understanding that where if you don't put the time or the necessary effort, then you can easily quickly misunderstand things and just kind of write it off. But to some extent, like I said prior, I think that's also a strength, right? Because you don't want transactional. In my view, we don't necessarily want people who are transactional, right? Who see something they can take and want to sort of make it more of a singular transaction. I want something. I want to get something out of it. I think it's more important to see it as a repeated game where you want to be part of a community that's growing. You see it as multiple interactions. You want to build a reputation, right? You're really bought into the ethos of what Decred is. So in some ways, I think you can see it as a weakness in one aspect, but I think it also is kind of like a strength in certain ways.
Akin, what are some of the roles do you see crypto assets playing in the third world?
I think there are multiple layers, right? I think first and foremost, like with Decred, I think, a big part of the ethos is creating a store of value that, lasts, right? And when you look at the developing world, when I look at, sub-Saharan Africa, you typically have lots of economies that are primarily resource dependent. So it's oil and gas, it's minerals, it's agriculture, right? It's resources that are being sold globally. Most governments make money that way. You don't have in most countries, you don't have a large tax base or I consider a large retail tax base. And so many of these economies tend to be very susceptible to monetary policy, how well the governments are governed, and to a large extent, what's happening everywhere else around the world, right? If your economy is indexed to the value of a certain resource, whether it's oil and gas or mineral, that is denominated in dollars, then the U.S. government as an entity has a lot of power and say into what things are worth in your country, right? Because they drive monetary policy, they drive global economics, and they have a lot of ability to really determine the price of commodities and assets. And so you end up, if you look at a lot of sub-Saharan African countries, particularly the ones that are heavily resource dependent, there's been a history of devaluations of currency. Every time there's an economic shock, anytime there's this global recession, it shows up in these countries as massive devaluations of their currencies, because they're getting into financial problems, certain challenges. And so lots of our currencies are just not reliable, right? And so any asset that you have in Africa that's denominated in a local currency, like your wealth erodes. Literally every 10-year economic cycle, there's some event that happens that basically wipes out the value of your asset in US dollar terms. So I think this idea of a non-sovereign store of value, I think is really, really interesting to lots of people. I think also this idea of, something that's a peer-to-peer network, digital exchange is also very attractive, because another problem that individuals in sub-Saharan African countries have is easy access to the ability to trade globally. Getting access to foreign exchange is not always easy. And even when you can access foreign exchange, lots of Africans run into problems trading globally because of issues around identity, right? So I could be an honest person. I could run a nice import-export business. But I don't necessarily, I may not even necessarily have a bank account, right? How do I interact in a global world where credit scores, information on who you are as an individual really drive your ability to access credit, access and acquire assets, buy things? Like, it's a real problem. And as the world sort of becomes more and more, as work sort of transitions from, going to a physical office space to literally just having a computer and producing code and doing things like that, you're seeing more and more young people in sub-Saharan Africa actually engaging with the global world, right? So the developers in Africa, the developers in Decred that are Africans who get paid in Decred, do great work, and now they have the ability to actually get paid without friction, right? In the past, being able to pay someone in Nigeria who might be, working on a project like this and figuring out ways to get dollars, to remit it back, to make sure they got it, could be extremely arduous in terms of the process. And now with digital currencies, some of that friction is being eroded. And you find that, as a medium of exchange, Bitcoin is gaining a lot of traction across African countries and other cryptocurrencies. So I think in that idea, just this idea of a mode to store your value and transact, I think as a first layer solution is huge. And I think that's where we're seeing a lot of adoption across Africa. But then, there are other things that I think as they become mature and develop, can create a lot of value for Africa. And this idea of decentralized organizations, decentralized entities, a lot of what we talk about at Decred, I think is really, really important. Because a big problem that you have across emerging markets is also an issue of governance, right? You tend to find very weak civil institutions, very weak governments, poor governance. There's a term used in international development called, low trust environments. So low trust countries where it's really hard to trust counterparties because, you might not have enough information on them. You don't know if they have money in the bank. It's hard to verify who they are. It's hard to verify that they're honest actors. All that introduces transactions costs, right? It introduces all sorts of risks into any form of transaction or contracting that is essentially this huge tax that's put up front that in many ways stifles the ability for investments to come in, for people to engage in businesses and for economies to grow. And I think where we're going in the crypto space is this idea of decentralized organizations that are, where the code is accurate, you can rely on it. It's, the rules of the game can be changed midway. I think, as these systems mature and grow, I think it could add a lot of value to just even governance in Africa from a sovereign standpoint, in terms of public institutions and getting greater transparency, all the way down to even how businesses conduct their business, right? There's no reason why I mean, I think you'll see a future where people build businesses on blockchain, right? People build businesses that are DAOs, and that raises the level of trust people might have in those institutions, because there are lots of ways you can verify their value. There are lots of ways you can build contracts that, cannot be tampered with. And I think when those systems get ready for prime time and begin to proliferate, I think, it'll be a huge boost for entities in Africa to adopt it.
Akin, how do you feel some of these markets have been marginalized by globalization?
And I think there are a couple of ways, right? So when I look at specifically around sub-Saharan Africa and the nature of how African countries have evolved, over 50, 60 years of independence, and even prior to that, Africa has always been basically a place where the first world or developed world comes to extract some form of value, whether it's getting raw materials that are extracted out, values added to them offshore, and then the benefit of that resource is maximized by the third party that acquires it. And so when you think about it, in many ways, in my view, Africa has been a large subsidy to the rest of the world. First it was post World War II, the Allies won. A lot of the colonial rulers were allies, England, France. And so a lot of the benefits in terms of being able to access resources in Africa cheaply essentially was a large subsidy to these countries in many ways, right? And the fact that commodities are priced in dollars gives the world reserve currency currently gives the U.S. government and its allies a lot of say and a lot of sway into how wealth is apportioned, right? What African countries get for what they're contributing. And then when you layer the fact that we've historically had poor governance across the continent, lots of funny things have happened historically across Africa where, crappy deals have been done that basically benefit multinationals or these global countries to the detriment of the local communities, like whether it's from, the value they're getting financially, all the way through like environmental issues that have, lack of environmental standards have created, huge catastrophes across a number of African countries, because there just weren't any standards in place. Civil institutions were weak, and multinationals really didn't care about basically following the rules they would have had to follow back home across Africa, right? So there've been all these externalities and all these other issues that have come as a result of it. And I think because there's been underinvestment in talent, underinvestment in education, a lot of which is the fault of, African governments. The main fault sits on their shoulders. You haven't had Africa really participating. In my view, Africa didn't, materially participate in the second or third industrial revolutions. Like there's not a lot of huge industry across Africa. And so because in many ways we didn't have the tools or the level of economic maturity that you saw in other parts of the world, I think Africa largely missed most of the benefits of globalization. But I think now with, a lot of the things that are happening around, distribution of technology, mobile technology has allowed Africa to sort of move or accelerate into this next phase. I think the blockchain space is going to create new opportunities for young Africans to participate. I think it's a great opportunity for forward-thinking countries to begin to think about how to position themselves and how to, benefit from this, essentially this new global phenomenon that's going to create a lot of new wealth and in some ways transfer wealth from, static centralized entities into decentralized networks. And so I think it's a huge opportunity.
What are some of the steps you feel can be taken to develop the growth of crypto assets, an area of the world you feel needed the most?
It starts with awareness, right? I think being able to give people some level of understanding of what this is and what it means to their daily lives, right? So, and I think it's less about the tech. It's less about, like, most Africans don't care what tech goes into a phone. All they know is I can get onto WhatsApp and I can communicate with everyone in my network. Like, it's the utility of the tool. And the substitute to that, I tell people all the time, when I was growing up in Nigeria, having a phone was a big deal. In the mid 80s, mid 90s, like, we had friends who'd come over to our house because we had their phone and they could make an international phone call. It's pretty ridiculous to think that, right? And so imagine running a business where you have to make phone calls, you have to communicate. If you don't have a phone, you're getting into a car, you're getting into a cab, you're going across town to meet whoever you're trying to engage with, and you're taking a chance that they may or may not be where you think they're going to be at a given point in time, right? So it's extremely inefficient. And when mobile phones hit and came into the country, some consulting firms did these analysis that said that, we don't think they're going to be more than, at steady state, a couple million users of mobile phones in Nigeria. Right now, there's more than one phone for every Nigerian citizen. And what people didn't realize is what's the substitute to having a phone where you can call someone and engage in a contractual conversation. The substitute is basically time. It's getting into a cab, it's spending money, it's going across town, it's missing them a couple of times till you find them. That's extremely inefficient. So people would pay a premium for the certainty that I could pick up a phone and the person on the other end will pick it up and we can have that conversation we have to. So in my view, I think that, that's a very important thing to think about. And I think as people begin to understand the utility around cryptocurrencies, the fact that, I can send Bitcoin anywhere in the world directly to the person that I'm trying to pay, right? The fact that, I think as applications get developed where you have, multi-sig wallets and you can build some level of programmability into money, it just creates a lot of interesting options and solutions that to someone in the United States who can have access to financial intermediaries like a bank and they can contract and do things for you, right? Okay, it's a nice to have, like, it's a great evolution, but to certain Africans who never even had that ability, it's like, it's a revolution. Like, it's like, wow, okay, I never had this before. Now I have it, right? I never had the ability to access foreign exchange. Now I can send Bitcoin. Like, that's a big deal. And I think as people begin to understand the utility and applications that are user-friendly get developed, you'll see a growth in adoption. No, so I think for me, it's a matter of information. It's a matter of people realizing the value it creates for them, and that those ideas proliferating, and entities coming in and actually building solutions that people can use and are made, for the locals.
So now, do you want to go into detail of how you're working on all this and how you feel DCR and other crypto assets can play a role?
So, I spent quite a bit of my time. I've spent, better part of this year really trying to just better understand and be informed of what's going on across sub-Saharan Africa. Oftentimes I think the assumption people make, and you hear this a lot, lots of people think about sub-Saharan Africa and immediately they talk about Nigeria. They might talk about South Africa. They talk about the large economies. Ethiopia might come up. And, one thing I've learned is, African countries are very, very distinct. And, there are many places across the continent that I've been surprised to realize are much more aware of what's going on in the crypto space and are beginning to, trying to figure out how to position their countries to participate and get value from these networks. And it's typically not the large countries that people usually think of the usual suspects, right? So, for example, there's a lot of interesting things I've seen happening in Uganda. Rwanda is known for pretty good governance, and it's a place where typically it's easy to set up a business. It's easier for people to start businesses. The government is really behind making things easier for people. And for me, all things being equal, you want to be in environments where you have less challenges to face, right? So if you're in a country where the government has a very negative stance towards it, it's just going to be harder, right? It's going to be harder to build a business. It's going to be harder to be in an environment that doesn't have progressive policies. So for me, I've spent the better part of this year really trying to scan the continent and figure out where the best places for Decred would be to really put our limited resources to try to build greater awareness about what Decred is, to create access through exchanges for people to acquire Decred, right? It's very easy to buy Bitcoin in most African countries today. But I think, getting Decred onto exchanges so that you can talk about it, but people can then buy it, I think is important. Getting more awareness around developer communities, right? So developers who are building things, these startup ecosystems that typically are quite progressive and are looking to figure out ways to build solutions that are locally relevant but can scale globally. So, I think for me, it's, I think the key things would be looking for environments that are relatively open and trying to engage with, initially developers and developer communities and folks in startup ecosystems, because those tend to be the people who are looking to build things. And I think, Decred has quite a bit to offer in those communities.
How has it been researching governance with the Wharton Governance Initiative program that you told me about? And what are some of the interesting observations that you've made working on this?
Sure. So a little bit. So the Wharton Governance Initiative, as the name says, it was a roundtable that was pulled together by the Wharton School of Business, and we had an inaugural roundtable meeting in June earlier this year, and it just brought a bunch of folks from the ecosystem together. Folks that work in Ethereum, folks on Polkadot. I think there are about 20 of us, and it was a global group of folks. There were a few folks from Europe. And the idea was just to kind of exchange thoughts and ideas around crypto governance. What is it? What do we think it is? What are people's concerns about how, projects may or may not be implementing governance? What structures are out there? So it's more of an information exchange that, has evolved into, this project that we then took on post to develop what we call a crypto governance questionnaire. And it's basically a set of questions that we felt that every project should be thinking about in terms of, so you can look at it as almost like a set of questions you can go through to kind of figure out where your project might be positioned, right? So how are we thinking about these things? Based on the answers to the questions. But it's also like a set of questions that anyone who's trying to either assess a project from an investment standpoint or think about projects to better understand the nature of governance for those projects. So a set of questions anyone can ask and walk through, and it'll give them a fairly decent appreciation for, what we figure is important, that these projects should be considering, either as they develop governance structures or, people want to participate in these networks. It's just a way to assess projects from a governance standpoint. And so we've been working on that for most of the summer, and in the next few weeks we should be making this questionnaire publicly available through a number of forums. But it's going to be open source. Anyone can pick up the questionnaire, answer questions. But part of the goal is to, at the very least, ensure or come up with at least a list of questions that are answered by key folks within certain large and small projects, right? To sort of at least have a library of responses that, anyone in the community can access, go in, read. And I think it'll be interesting to just see how also different people think about the governance structures of networks. Because I can bet that you might, the way one participant in Bitcoin or Ethereum might think the project works versus someone else could be very different. So it's just a tool we hope will increase the amount of discourse and scrutiny around how projects are governed, and hopefully produce conversations that add value to the space broadly. And so I've been happy to represent Decred in this forum, and I think it might evolve into other things. So the other thoughts we have on kind of extending it and creating ideas around standards around governance, and so there might be other things that evolve out of it. But in a nutshell, that's what it is and where we've gone so far.
So now circling back to DCR, what are some of your long-term concerns for the project or holes that you may see that it has?
I think the product is really young, right? I mean, Decred was launched in 2016. In many ways, it's an experiment, like many other projects are. And for where we are so far, I think a lot has been done. I think more important than anything, like the spirit and the culture and the idea around what Decred wants to be is a noble one. And in my interactions with folks, the vast majority of people are trying to do the right thing. They're trying to think about what the future might look like, and they want to be involved in it. And I think that's really important. And so there are not many things that totally concern me. I think, the biggest concern might be the fact that it's just still relatively young, and we don't have a benefit of Bitcoin being around for 10, 11 years, right? But I think that we will get there. The things I think, if I could think about a challenge, is just wondering how this scales over time, right? So I think we're like 80 plus contractors in Decred, something like that. You have orders of magnitude more people who are involved on an ongoing basis. I mean, it's still relatively small in terms of the people who are actively participating, what I'd consider every day or every week, or, actively engaged. And so I just wonder what that would look like if we have thousands of people literally, joining actively and, being active on Politeia, being active on some of the forums and trying to contribute. I just wonder how that scales over time, and what it means for what Decred might look like down the line. So it's not necessarily a concern. It's just sort of like, I wonder how these things scales over time and what it would look like as things evolve. And if we'll be able to retain a lot of in my view, the good cultural trajectory we're on. Can this thing scale to the point where we're not, decisions can still be made in a efficient way, that the community can corral around consensus. How would decision making on Politeia evolve as more and more people join? Those are things I just think about. I won't necessarily call them concerns, but they do weigh on my mind as, how do these things evolve over time, and is it scalable, and, what changes might have to be made down the road as we see things kind of come about.
Now, so what are some of the things that you're most optimistic about when it comes to the project?
I mean, I think I'm really optimistic about this idea of being, when you think about, just portfolio management, being a good alternative to Bitcoin, and this idea that, we're trying to improve upon what we consider some of the weaknesses of Bitcoin and iterate on that and experiment around things and essentially push the barrier, right? I think that I don't think anyone fully knows what, the promise of Bitcoin and blockchain is going to look like 10 or 20 years down the line. And I think, it would be an incredible shame if, like some people, we just think, well, Bitcoin is it. There can be nothing else. It's almost like saying, America Online was it, and that was the internet. And we're never going to evolve from AOL because that was the greatest thing ever, right? But that's not been the case, right? Things have evolved. And, I think that this idea of us trying to push the boundaries of not just what a cryptocurrency could be from a store of value standpoint, but we're thinking a lot bigger and a lot more broadly around this idea of decentralized organizations, new forms of people getting together and collaborating and working towards shared interest. That general idea of trying to build something that could effectively, compete with nation states, replace them potentially, give more sovereignty to individuals and more power in how they control their wealth and their privacy. Like all those things, I think are very, very important. And I'm very optimistic around the idea that I think lots of people in Decred have on us trying to push those boundaries and experiment with new forms of governance, new forms of organization, and see what might come of it. right? And so just this idea that, I think we're conservative in the right ways, but I feel pretty confident that, we're designed to evolve over time and take smart risks. And so for me, those things make me very confident that Decred will evolve intelligently. And as long as we maintain, the ethos around, what Decred is and what we're bought into, I think, it makes me very optimistic about what's to come as we continue building.
Now, Akin, what are your closing thoughts and message to newcomers and potential stakeholders? And where can people find you?
I think, to folks who are trying to come in, I think, everyone needs to sort of put in their time, right? So like for me, it was curiosity about what Decred was and what made it different. And I just kept digging away. And I kept trying to feed that curiosity to truly understand what it was. And so for folks who are trying to come in, I think there's a lot of noise in the crypto space, and you sort of have to make up your own conclusions. And you only come to those, what I consider smart conclusions, if you put in the time and effort to really dig in and investigate. And, Decred is very accessible in terms of people willing to give their time to new folks, to talk to them, to engage with them. So I'd say, do your research, read blog posts, start with Google, find resources, meet with us in our social media channels, Matrix, Telegram, wherever you find us. And I'm sure you'll find people who are willing to engage.
Excellent. And where can people find you?
People can find me. I think the best way is Twitter, honestly. So my handle is Akin Sawyerr. That's AkinSawyer. I'm on Twitter every day. So that's typically the best way to find me. Alternatively, you can find me on our, Decred Matrix channel. Those are the two places that you would find me on a daily basis.
Excellent. Well, Akin, I appreciate you coming on the show, man. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.